Welcome to the Jumpstart Your Instructional Design Career podcast. This podcast is dedicated to helping new and aspiring instructional designers get the knowledge, skills, and confidence to stand out in the field and land their first corporate instructional design job. I'm your host, Jill Davidian, and think of this podcast as a way to put my over 20 years of corporate ID experience in your back pocket. I've helped over 500 new instructional designers successfully transition into the field, and I know what hiring managers are looking for. Whether you're looking for a career change and exploring if instructional design is right for you, or you know you want to become an ID and have no idea how to get started, you are in the right place. Join me each week for actionable guidance as we explore how to build your portfolio, transform your resume, and interview with confidence. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are talking about the ADDIE and SAM instructional design models, the difference between them, and how they're actually used in reality. If you aren't familiar with these models, it's really important that you become familiar with them because they're going to come up in job postings and interviews. Once you get on the job, you often end up doing a mix of things and become less dependent on the model or framework. But these models are a great jump-off point when you don't know where to get started. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the ADDIE model because I did a whole episode on it called How the Instructional Design Process is Like Building a House. I use the analogy of when you go to a home builder to get a house built, but that episode was really based on the ADDIE model for instructional design. So if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely go check it out. What I'm going to focus on today is the difference between the two models. The ADDIE model stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. It's been around, I feel like, since the beginning of time, and everybody in ID knows it. If you don't, most wouldn't consider you an ID. The ADDIE model is the one most mentioned and asked about in interviews. It's a very academic model because real life has nuances, and the ADDIE model is very straightforward, often ignoring those nuances. It has each phase listed with equal weight, meaning it looks like you spend as much time in implementation as you do in design, whereas implementation is often just handing your completed e-learning course to an LMS or learning management system administrator to roll out. So often, implementation doesn't actually take that long, but if you look at the ADDIE model, it looks like it takes just as long as the design phase. So it's not always the best model to use in real-world instructional design, but it's a good model to learn from and model your projects after. It's the one that you're going to learn in grad school, and like I said, it's the one that you're going to be most asked about in an interview. Now, SAM stands for Successive Approximation Model, which means nothing, so don't worry about that. It does mean something, obviously, but nothing that you're really going to care about like the ADDIE acronym. All SAM is ADDIE brought to life. A lot of people get caught up in ADDIE and SAM and which one to use, and at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. Really, all SAM is ADDIE brought to life. So they're really sort of the same. One is going to be more nuanced and have more real-life application than the other one, but both are great models to frame your projects after. When you really do get into the real world, you're going to find that there's lots of different directions and branches and twists and turns that these projects take. But for purposes of learning, either one of these is a great model to start with. I really think SAM is more applicable in real life because, like I said, it really is ADDIE brought to life. It's much easier to have a visual to go with what I'm saying. So if you're that kind of person that needs a visual and want to see a visual of both of these models, you can follow the link in the show notes to the ultimate guide to becoming an instructional designer, which is on my website. If you scroll down that page, you're going to find a graphic for both ADDIE and SAM. If you want to take a look at those and follow along as we talk about them in this episode, you're absolutely welcome to, or you can take a look at that later if you're driving or not in a position to take a look at it now. So SAM starts with something called the Savvy Start, which usually takes the form of a kickoff meeting, and it's like a mini analysis. Whereas ADDIE has analysis weighted just like design and development, because remember, every phase is weighted the same and would imply that a thorough needs, gap, or learning analysis is done, SAM doesn't skip that completely, but it does streamline it into what's called the Savvy Start and information gathering pieces of the preparation phase. So the preparation phase is really that analysis phase in ADDIE. So as you'll see, it looks like SAM sometimes uses different words, but you really can take SAM and overlay it with ADDIE and be able to see where they actually match up. Often when you start an instructional design project, a lot of the work has already been done for you to gather all of the information that you need in terms of learners, objectives, goals for the project, learning gap, etc. And so you'll gather that information at a kickoff meeting or around a kickoff meeting, and that is that savvy start. You will ask some questions, you'll get some answers and move on. No need to linger here. So the takeaway from that is that SAM is really showing you that often the needs analysis is really boiled down into a mini needs analysis versus a full-blown one in ADDIE. Now, the next two phases of SAM are design and development. And that's because design and development are the two biggest phases of any instructional design process. Again, in ADDIE, it looks like they are weighted the same as the other phases, but in SAM, you can see they're actually bigger phases than everything else. And that's actually true in reality. Design is where we design the learning solution, plan it out, and development is where we actually develop it in the e-learning authoring tool or create materials if it's for a virtual instructor-led training, etc. The design and development phases of SAM are more descriptive and that you can see what's in them, whereas you can't with ADDIE. It just shows the phase overall. You can see that they're iterative. You get feedback along the way, evaluate, and make changes as you go. And sometimes you have to take a step back to take 2 steps forward. While the overall process has an endpoint, getting to that endpoint is not always linear, as it appears to be in ADDIE. But again, SAM isn't a completely separate model from ADDIE. Both have design and development phases. It's just refining and honing in on the things that we actually do in the real world. You will see that SAM places evaluation throughout in design and development, not only at the end like ADDIE, because we're constantly evaluating what we're doing, getting feedback, improving, and iterating as IDs. This, again, is taking something in ADDIE and further refining it for the real world. You will see that SAM introduces something called the prototype. Many times projects have to be rolled out quickly, and while the best method is to take your time as you move through each phase, sometimes it isn't possible. So again, SAM is bringing us the real-world nuances. A prototype is a really dressed down or basic version of the course that is mocked up for the client or subject matter expert for review. It's often used instead of a storyboard. If you recall from that episode on how instructional design is like building a house, we talked about creating a storyboard for your e-learning project, which is a description of what will be on each slide, from the audio to the interactions to the on-screen text to the images. This is usually created in Word and sent to the client or subject matter expert for review before the course is developed, so as not to waste time developing a course that the SME vetoes later on, SME being subject matter expert. Sometimes, not really often, but sometimes a prototype replaces that, where the instructional designer or e-learning developer creates a very simplistic version of the course in a tool like Storyline. So they're jumping into the e-learning authoring tool and creating a very simplified version of the course, then checking with the SME to make sure that they are on the right track, and then they further develop. So they really skip that storyboarding phase. It often saves time because it's already in the tool versus creating a Word doc with all the details and then creating the course. But it has to be a stripped down version, because if not, and you go and create the whole version of the course and the client hates it, you just wasted a lot of time. So you'll see that the SAM model accounts for the prototype, whereas you don't see that detail in ADDIE. Now, in the development phase, SAM has an alpha, beta, and gold, which are 3 iterations of development, with lots of feedback from clients and stakeholders each time. But as you can see from the circular nature, it can be even more than that. Again, this is just further refining ADDIE. ADDIE doesn't break out development, but SAM does. You will see that implementation is part of the develop phase because you often implement a pilot, test, etc., and then make improvements before you release to everyone. A pilot is really a first iteration where you're getting feedback. It's like a test. It maybe doesn't go out to everybody, and you see how it's working. Is it achieving the goals that it's supposed to be achieving? Does everything function correctly? And then it gets rolled out to everyone else. You'll see rollout at the end, which is the true implementation, because that usually doesn't involve IDs. A pilot might involve IDs, but a rollout at the end typically doesn't. Sometimes it does involve instructional designers, but it's a much smaller part of the process. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of how SAM really is just further refining ADDIE, adding some details and some nuances, and accounting for the fact that certain phases do take longer, some phases are circular, and some phases include other phases. So it really does get down to what we actually do in corporate ID. Now remember, these are models to learn from and use as a starting point, but please don't get caught up in what model you're using and if you are following it directly. Each company has a different way of doing things, and sometimes additional nuances will mean that you can't follow either of these exactly as I said earlier. That's okay and very common. As you get more and more experience, you're going to veer off and do things a little bit differently with each project. You just really do what you need to do to get the project done. Every project is different. If you get caught up in the details of which model you're using and which step you're on, sometimes you can't see the forest from the trees and you're going to get stuck. But as I said earlier, I know that when you're new, you need something to hold on to. You need something to follow. You can't just start from a blank slate. If you want to follow something, I would definitely follow SAM because it's really closer to what happens in reality, as I've been saying. But make sure you know ADDIE because, as I said, it's often discussed in job postings and will come up in interviews. It may even come up in an interview where you have to discuss the difference between the two, and that's where this episode is going to come in really handy. For more information on ADDIE versus SAM, you can read the section I have written about it in my Ultimate Guide to Becoming an Instructional Designer, which is on my website, linked in the show notes, or you can check out a book by Michael Allen called Leaving ADDIE for SAM. I hope you learned something new today. Bye for now, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Jumpstart Your Instructional Design Career podcast. I hope you've gained valuable insights that will help you on your instructional design journey. Did you have a moment of clarity? Maybe you have some additional questions. Let's discuss in my Facebook group, which can be found in the description below and in the show notes at learningstrategyanddesign.com/podcast. If you love the show and want to hear more, follow the podcast and give me a rating and review. Let me know if there's a specific topic you'd like me to cover or a guest you'd like me to have on the show. You can also check out more resources for breaking into instructional design on my website, learningstrategyanddesign.com. Stay tuned next week as I bring you more tips, tools, and strategies to jumpstart your instructional design career.